in a commercial structure. Where's my favorite disclaimer? I have to show it. But stepping away from that, we'll look at several examples on the borderline of the 80s and the 90s. We looked at the first gallery, which was established not by curators or art critics, but by a young businessman, an entrepreneur. It was a Strasnoy Boulevard building, and first he wanted to open a furniture store, but he decided to start off with an art gallery, and he invited his old friends, artists, Aidan Salakhova and Yevgeny Mita and Alexander Couture. The second gallery that we had a look at opened up in 1990. It was called Regina Art Gallery, created by Vladimir Ovcharenko, a young banker who opened the space in Preobrazhensky Square first and foremost in order to gift it to his wife, Regina, hoping this is her favorite pastime. But Regina wasn't particularly interested in the gallery and its activities. And to this day, Vladimir Ovcharenko is still operating it. Initially, he had a very aggressive strategy of interacting with the audience, with the professional community. He would shock them with his exhibitions and initiatives that were orchestrated for him by Oleg Kulik, a sculptor. And the new structure that I wanted to present today is called the L Gallery, that also opened up in 1990. It was in Oktyabrskaya Street 26. And it was a gallery that really needs to be reviewed. All of these regional exhibition halls had to become self-sufficient, and each gallery, regardless of whether it was Sokol or Selanka or Bilayeva, these all now function as parts of a single network of Moscow exhibition halls. Back then, the city didn't know what to do with these spaces. And the heads of the exhibition halls of Moscow had to come up with the program on their own, and they had to source financing on their own as well. Lyubov Salnikova, the director, a young and a very ambitious manager, invited a curator, a graduate of the historian art critic faculty of the Moscow State, Elena Romanova, and together with her, Elena Silina, that together with Lyubov Salnikova created the L Gallery. Lena, and Lyubov, their names, and the initial letter L gave the name to the gallery. It was a gallery that was initially set up as one that would support conceptual artists from the 70s and the 80s, focusing specifically on the fact that this is their core target group. And that's exactly what they did over the first 3 years of their existence, and they would astound the audiences with the curators' initiatives. Despite all of the financial restrictions, they would hold the regular exhibitions, and they always had a very original approach to posing conceptual questions. For instance, one of the first exhibitions that was held in the L Gallery. You can see on the slide in front of you a reconstruction of this exhibition. An interesting fact about the exhibition is the main characters of the Moscow Conceptualist School when born in Moscow. For instance, Andrei Filipov was born in the city of Murmansk. Andrei Monastyrsky came from a far village in the far north. Vadim Zakharov came from Dushanbe, etc., etc. None of them came from Moscow. Then, carried away by the mystical concepts, the curators took this bio information on the artists as the basis, the place where they were born, the date, and the time of their birth. And they gave these anonymous cards to an astrologist that came up with a very accurate description of each of the artists, and this would serve as an explanation for their works. Other projects that were just as complex and risky remind us of the time when everything was possible. For instance, Yuri Albert showcased a project called Mom Look an Artist, documenting his performance from 2 years back in the L Gallery. Back then, he went out to the place that he lived in Moscow, a nearby park, and he set up his canvas. He had his chair. He started to paint park landscape. Soon after, he was surrounded by curious people, and one of the kids shouted out, "Mom, look, an artist." All of his attempts to depict the park failed, but there was a great performance that took place. And documenting this performance, he created this project at the L Gallery, not only depicting Albert surrounded by children, but also open canvases with gas burners that would symbolize the freedom of creativity and the enthusiasm of doing something new at a moment when they finally have the freedom to create. And there were tremendous opportunities that opened up for any artistic languages to be voiced. Subsequently, when Yelena Selina, after a conflict with her partner, decided to leave in 1997, the gallery somewhat changed its vector of development. They would practically start to host everybody who wished to be exhibited, including young authors like Vladimir Dubasarsky and Alexander Vinogradov. It could be non-official masters of old art, Mr. Braginsky. And after he came back to Russia, Gallery was the first to exhibit his works. Selena separated from her ex-partners and created her own basis. This was December 1993. And the platform for the new gallery they found in a one-room apartment of her friend, the last floor of an old building in Olansky Street that he inherited after his divorce. It was completely empty. The owner would sleep in the kitchen, and the room would be used to host all of the main exhibitions that were unlike exhibitions entirely. And even today, this type of exhibitions would ignite interest because of the experimental nature. Helena Selena, back at the beginning of her gallery curator journey, decided to call it a project. It was a project gallery. Initially, she didn't think she would focus on a circle of artists in order to create a pool of paintings to be sold, working with the market. That's not what she wanted to do. She would work as an expert in the context of contemporary art of the day. And on her platform, she would formulate the main trends that would emerge during each of the periods. This could be exhibitions of Boris Mikhailov's photographs, or an exhibition of paintings or installations by Igor Makarevich, but the main bulk of projects, not exhibitions, of the Excel gallery would support this vector. They would identify trends. They would be trendsetters for new names. Selena worked with each of the new artists and non-artists as well. For instance, exhibition number 2 in the space. This is January 1994. It was created by an art critic, not an artist. also a graduate of the historical faculty of Moscow State University, Sergei Yepikhin, who's now one of the scientific workers at the Tretyakov Gallery, the metaphysical but if Bachstein, back then, Sergei Yepikhin was rather a theoretical critic and not a practical participant of contemporary art. And he would be arguing with Bachstein. All of the artistic community back then knew that Bachstein shouldn't be allowed in. He would occupy the phone for hours and he would send faxes out to America, to Europe, to Latin America. It was somebody who loved to communicate. It was somebody who would endlessly build bridges and consolidate connections. And he was in this permanent contact with his colleagues all over the world. The principle of the exhibition was as follows. Yepikhin and Bachstein, sitting in different parts of Moscow, would communicate with each other via faxes. And the fax was set up in the Excel gallery. Yepikhin would send a message, Bachstein would respond, or a virtual Bachstein would respond, up until the fact that the small room in the gallery space was filled with these papers. Alexei Belyaev Gentoft presented himself in something not as a glamorous artist that works with the imperial themes or something that includes grandiose narratives that have to do with the global geopolitics. His first exhibition was rather psychedelic in nature. It was called Inviting a Spirit. We're talking about regular tiles. Using handprints, Belyaev Gentoft would create the image of Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator. He was associated with the real art, unlike the liquid Terminator of the second series that was more associated with the postmodernism. All of the surfaces were covered with various fruits. The fruits would float in a huge aquarium that was set up in the middle of the room. The whole atmosphere reminded the atmosphere of an underground club that's about to go into a rave party. And mysterious white powder was on the floor, just washing powder, but it was highly suspicious. The Excel Gallery wasn't afraid of incredibly ambitious projects, and one of these happened towards the end of the first year of the gallery's existence. They really changed a lot of the exhibitions. Every 2 weeks, they would have a new exhibition in place, and this was mandatory. And they would prepare a text for each of the exhibitions, and this rhythm and this intensity of the discussion that was being created around the gallery creators would attract a lot of people, would draw in crowds, and over the course of the few months, it became a central point for artistic Moscow communities. By the Day of Knowledge, the 1st of September 1994, they sponsored an exhibition by Lyudmila Gorlova, who would exhibit her works. The themes were evolving around resistance of kids to their parents, and this was organized in the maternity ward. The gallerist herself, dressed up as a nurse, wearing a medical mask and a hat, that would set up the paintings on sterilized podiums next to boxes with newborns. One of the most contested works, The Branch by Andrei Monastersky, was exhibited at the gallery, and today this is something that seems very obscene. 100,000 rubles were spent and it was acquired by the Tretyakov Gallery. But back then, and even today, Monastersky's branch is a symbol. How should I put this? Of the ambiguity of the language of contemporary art, its intellectual grace, that very few were bold enough. This is 1996, there's a typo on the slide, or would dare to display. The range of artists that the Excel Gallery worked with is highly extensive. These could be very young artists, such as in the vinyl bones or Igor Makarevich, Boris Orlov, and others. The Excel Gallery became the only gallery that decided to offer its space for the works of very young artists that were at the Institute of Contemporary Art. So they were first-year students. Joseph Backstein, as part of his institutional activities, launched an educational program that was called New Artistic Strategies. And this program continues to exist to this day at the Institute of Contemporary Art, named after Joseph Backstein. Yelena Sileva, the curator of the Excel Gallery, took on this risk to offer her space that was now located in the Sadovaya Ring in one of the basement spaces to very young and completely unknown artists. To them, it was an incredible opportunity and a challenge to showcase their works to the wider audiences. I can testify to the fact that over the course of the 90s, the Excel Gallery would pick up popularity. A record studio called Melody threw out a lot of old vinyl discs that were not in demand anymore. And based on that, key projects were formulated, for instance, by such artists as Irina Korina, that back then only started to study contemporary art at the Backstein Institute, and a lot of other accomplished authors today took on the slippery slope of contemporary art at the Excel Gallery. This is what this famous exhibition looked like. Some of the details are captured here. And going forward, the Excel Gallery doesn't only expand as an institution. Excel project emerges at Art Strelka that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on. The creators of the gallery become highly influential, and they are now part of expert councils of such projects as the Moscow Arts Fair, and a lot of the other initiatives that required an expert opinion. Together with Aidan Salakhova and Vladimir Ovcharenko, that you're already familiar with, one of the exhibitions at the end of 1999 was dedicated to a completely complex matter. This was the second year after 1998, this dreadful crisis, and a famous architect who focused on the history of architecture, Yuri Avakumov, went through letters and diaries by Pushkin. And he collected all of the fragments of his letters that, in one way or another, mentioned the financial issue that Pushkin struggled with all through his life. And there were quotes that were displayed all across the exhibition hall. They were written on just regular um, notebook papers, but Pushkin and money were as relevant as ever by then. Just as Aidan Salachova, Yelena Selena could really testify to the fact that the main contemporary artists of the 90s were Shishkin and Aivazovsky, the representatives of the market of antique art that helped galleries survive because these projects were impossible to make money on. That's why it's an actual fact of life that a gallerist wouldn't first turn to a hairdresser or a fashion boutique, but they would wash the floors themselves before meeting their guests. And this was an actual fact of life, and nobody was ashamed of that. State institutions also evolve alongside, focusing on contemporary art. Enthusiasts are dedicated to their works. Leonid Bazhanov, someone who was already responsible for some very interesting events as part of the institutions that he had created, the Hermitage Society and the Center of Contemporary Art located in Yakimanka. 1991, he leaves his post of director to Victor Mediana, and he takes on a challenge at the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation, where soon after he becomes the head of the Department of Contemporary Art. He's forced to communicate with the very rigid people from other ministries, from the Ministry of Culture themselves. They had no clue what contemporary art was and what purpose it served in those economic and political circumstances. Bazhanov, nonetheless, was able to insist on the fact that the state institution was necessary, and a small budget was allocated for the State Center of Contemporary Art for its first year of existence um, in the Vorodnikovsky Perelook. There were just two rooms, small rooms with the first state curators that were familiar with contemporary art, that were working with contemporary art. Gradually, through traveling exhibitions, through making projects beyond Moscow, as well as the Moscow region, the state institution became more and more prominent. And Leonid Bazhanov, as the artistic director of the State Center of Contemporary Art, was also able to open a branch, the North Western St. Petersburg branch, then the Volgovatska branch in Nizhny Novgorod. They all continue to function with the exception of the St. Petersburg branch. And I think the Mid-Volga ones, we'll talk about this a bit later. Over the course of almost a decade of its existence, very significant centers opened up across Russia, focused on contemporary art, helping regional artists make it, develop their community, and finance new events. These cities, St. Petersburg, Yekaterinburg, Kaliningrad, and Nizhny Novgorod, are one of the strongest still in terms of regional centers where the artistic community is well familiar with contemporary art and its languages. Alongside this State Contemporary Center of Art, he was also the one in charge of the Jardina Russian Pavilion that was abandoned for many years. an exhibition of Russian artists in 1990 that took place in a completely different space, not on the territory of the Russian pavilion. During the Soviet times, this pavilion was supported by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that considered it to be a burden. They really couldn't be bothered to look after the building and the territory. And by 1993, this wonderful building and the garden around it were um, abandoned. And he had to first take it under the wing of the Ministry of Culture, and he had to find financing for the reconstruction of the building. And he was able to find an amazing Italian mecenate. And in exchange for financing the repairs, he received the title of an honorable consul in Venice. There was a drug addict community there, syringes on the floors everywhere. And just before the first post-Soviet exhibition opened up, the installation of the Red Pavilion by Yakubakov that we talked about earlier, the ministry officials would sweep the autumn leaves themselves, where this ceremony was to take place. So over the course of a few years, he was able to achieve quite a lot. He was able to make a name on an international arena and to find new budgets, new money, new audiences, and new spaces. The state, the Federal Center of Contemporary Art, consolidates its positions throughout the 90s. In 1995, Bazhanov hands over the curatorship function to Victor Mesian, the curator of the first post-Soviet exhibition and the creator of an artistic intellectual magazine that was only read by the authors, they would joke. It was so confusing. Victor Mesian, Evgeny Yas, Dmitry Putov, and Vladimir Fishkin together were able to use the space of the renewed Russian pavilion, and they were able to organize a very progressive exhibition dedicated to the contemporary state of Russia in the context of global development. Over the last decade, the narrative would evolve around the lower hall with tables, with the main plots relevant to those times, including advertising campaigns of companies that came from the Western brands, the Chechen conflicts, and the construction of Cathedral of Christ the Savior. And the adaptation of this new world constructed on the derelict of the destroyed empire. There was a box with a note asking for support. They wanted to acquire consciousness. The world has to acquire consciousness one way or another. This is a quote from Karl Marx. Against the backdrop of the complex situation in Russia itself, there were other local wars that were happening, and systems that previously were considered to be stable collapsed. For instance, the Yugoslavian Republic. One way or another, the State Center of Contemporary Art was able to function throughout the 90s, and it was able to operate this international platform with the Russian Pavilion. Frankly speaking, I would be completely wrong. And at Bachstein's Memory Day, I had to mention this instead of glorifying our head of institution, Bazhanov, and Joseph Bachstein and Leonid Bazhanov. They would have never been able to achieve anything if it weren't for the dedicated girls in speech marks. One of these girls was the head of the Tretyakov Gallery until recently, Zelfira Trigulova, who worked in a curatorship group to prepare Rikutopy's exhibition in 1993. When the exhibition finally opened in 1993 in Germany, one of the partners, one of the officials that initiated the project, pushed by the girls, toasted to the fact that we conceptualized everything and then the girls came along and did everything, made it happen. That's exactly the case. Three girls, in parentheses at least, that would work on implementing the projects of our male maestros. They would make the impossible possible. They would write letters to the Directorate of Sadeo Giardini, to the Ministry of Culture of the Russian Federation. They would organize exhibitions in Moscow. They would organize traveling exhibitions abroad. They were building a new institutionalized order, in fact. And another thing that we highlight, they went at the realm, but they would support all of these initiatives. And as you will have seen, for one Vladimir Ovcharenko, there was several female figures supporting him. Yelena Kurlyantseva, that helped Joseph Bachstein to develop the strategy of the Institute of Contemporary Art, and was also the creator and the presenter of a TV program at NTV. That was then a very new TV channel. Irina Alpatova, that helped Leonid Bazhanov to organize the other art exhibition at the Tretyakov Gallery in 1990, and Olga Rumantseva, who organized festivals of new technologies throughout the 90s, and many others that I would love to talk about, but there just isn't enough time. In 2003, in Barrikadная Zoologicheskaya Street, finally, the building of the State Center of Contemporary Art opened up. It wasn't a big one, but it was incredibly cozy, and it was one that had a very intensive life. It would attract, not because of its new exhibition, but as a place for networking. There was a wonderful family cafe. There were lectures by Evgeny Barabanov. There was a lectorium, but unfortunately, this building was quite crammed. The cell of the building was taken up by the archives, the collection of the Center of Contemporary Art that took a decade to be put together. Starting from 2011, 2012, the heads of the State Center of Contemporary Art were not also supporting the regional branches, but were in constant negotiations about the necessity of expanding the territory of contemporary art at state level, at federal level, and it would keep coming up with one project after another of an expanded architectural version of the State Center of Contemporary Art. In the regions, some of the spaces would open up. Some of them weren't very successful, as perhaps this huge medieval tower in Kaliningrad that they never were able to restore all the abandoned high school in Yekaterinburg that was reformatted to be an exhibition hall. But one of the projects was definitely successful, the Nizhny Novgorod Arsenal at the center of the city. It was the first branch to open up its doors to the wider audiences in 2011. It demonstrated the fact that it's not just Moscow, but the regions as well can boast these technologically advanced halls and exhibition spaces and professional storage facilities. The first exhibition from 2011. In 2014, another project was approved for the State Center of Contemporary Art at Hudinska Field. The head of the government signed a decree on allocating the federal budget for the foundation of this new center in Hudinska Field, headed by the then Minister of Culture, Mr. Medinsky. They set the first founding stone, indicating the fact that this building would be constructed. But in 2015, the budget was stopped, so the project was mothballed, and the center itself was then resubordinated to Ros-ISO, a system that's there to implement the projects by the Ministry of Culture. Administratively, this system became a part of the regional branches of the State Pushkin Museum. This is the end of the federal program to support contemporary art. Hopefully, this is a temporary situation. Today's building in Zalogicheskaya Street has been handed over to the Oriental Museum to host one of the departments of the African People's Museum. Nothing is happening in the building at the moment, but regional branches continued to function, luckily. In Vladikavkaz, where a Lanica regular festival is held, that's curated by the Caucasian branch of the Pushkin Museum, the Ural branch, of course, in Yekaterinburg, the Kaliningrad branch, and the Siberian branch as well in Tomsk. Before the center acquired its own building, there were a lot of events taking place with the State Center of Contemporary Art. It was hard for Bazhanov to compete with individual initiatives, such people as Olga Sviplova, despite the fact that she graduated from Moscow State University with a degree in psychology, and she had a thesis. She defended a PhD in psychology. Starting from 1986 or 1987, she started to work with contemporary art, the contemporary community. She created an association called the Art of the End of the 20th Century that helped a lot of projects. She was the only one who was able to talk big capital people into investing into these strange projects. But nonetheless, investment banks, investment companies, and other commercial structures would happily give Olga Sviblova money. They were happy to do that, then give the money to the less convincing state officials or members of the contemporary art community. In 1995, Olga Sviplova agreed the Moscow House of Photography, the mayor of Moscow gives her a big budget and a carte blanche. At that point, they did not have their own space. That's why Sviblova decided to organize a total event that took place in the spring of 1996. This was the first photo biennale, the first international month of photography in Moscow. That's what it was called back then. The help of Olga Sviblova, all of Moscow would immerse themselves into photography, starting from the first hall of the biennale that was located in Kuznetsky Most, House 11. I think it's a place they sell Indian trinkets in now. All of the exhibition halls across Moscow would follow suit. It's a very fragile but a very powerful woman who forced Russians to love photography. Photography before that was considered to be some artistic, but hosting these large-scale festivals on an annual basis, she was able to turn photographic art into one of the main practices of the new art of the 90s. And subsequently, having acquired a new building, the Multimedia Art Museum, the Moscow House of Photography was renamed into the Multimedia Art Museum. Sviblova was able to acquire a storage facility to store the key works of Russian and international photographers. At this biennale, they displayed this multimeter photograph. This is 2008. But in the center of the project, at the Kuznetsky Most Biennale, they had this set of figures that seemed to be standing in an endless line. It was a projection by Yelena Selina together with Vladimir Fridkis. She was a producer and a manager. The idea was she wanted to show the first 5 years of life in Russia, of free Russian art and a free Russia. It wasn't easy, it was a struggle, but nonetheless, there were a lot of transformations, a lot of positive change, and this is something that she wanted to capture. Friedkis, a very famous Moscow fashion photographer, together with Yelena Selina, came up with a project. They reserved a big studio, booked a big studio. They had stationary light that wouldn't change, that would be set up. And over the course of a number of days, Selena would bring together groups of Russian artists, art curators with their dogs, their friends, their families, their husbands that would come to the spot, to this workshop. They would line up and they would have this portrait of the generation that Yelena Selena later on wrote about, like a panegyric that was dedicated to the decade that we're currently looking at. She talked about how easy it was to live in a world that was surrounded by people that were on the same page with you, despite all of the bureaucratic red tape struggles, despite the poverty. Essentially, there were no institutions. They were working greenfield entirely. And it was a joy to work in that context because it was a very fertile soil that would come to bring new artistic discoveries. At the end of the decade, another important event took place that only confirmed the idea of the Ministry of Culture, Mikhail Shvydkoy. I love to quote him. At a ministry meeting, he would say, as we all know, today the main of the arts for us is real estate. A great initiative was organized by the mayor of Moscow, Lushkov, and his famous sculptor Zurab Tsereteli, that was not only loved back then by Lushkov, but also had to do with the union of Moscow artists, and based on his private gallery, several buildings opened up. Through an internal redistribution of real estate that were handed over from the Academy of Arts and another Moscow institution to the Moscow Museum of Contemporary Art. Several places opened up. The first building that opened up was the building of an ex-clinic, an ex-hospital in Petrovka 25. And then there were other buildings in Yermolaevsky Street, the street of Sheltovsky, that was renamed. And this is where Moscow Artists Union was established. Then there was another one in Gogolevsky Boulevard, Zurab Tsereteli's exhibition hall in Kropotkinsk, etc., etc. Something had to be collected in this space. Things needed to be stored somewhere. And Zurab Tsereteli wasn't perceived, wasn't very welcome as the head of this initiative. He understood his strategic mistake, and he handed this initiative over to his grandson, Vasily Tsereteli, who took this on. And starting from its second year, the museum started to grow and develop. Various educational programs would take place, and thanks to the effort put in by Vasily Tsereteli and the mayor and the Ministry of Culture of the mayor, new works of artists, of Moscow artists, would be added to the collection. For the 90s, this became the final platform, springboard, to make sure that art over the subsequent decades not only evolves as an organic structure, that reminded the booming growth of vegetation during the Soviet times. I mean, the canvas of our artistic life that developed chaotically. And for the new decade, this chaotic flow of values were not in a good fit anymore. So throughout the 2000s, a completely different approach has been formulated, a completely different system of values and views related to contemporary art. I'll remind you that during the first year of the first decade in 2000, two more museums open up. Two exhibitions open up that could become legitimate museums. The museum called the Other Art, Leonid Talichkin's collection, and the Museum Center of the Russian Institute of Humanities, and another one in Tretykovka on Krymsky Val. Finally, there were museum funds, and there were open exhibition halls, and there was a canon that was created covering previous decades. Only the Tretyakov concept evolved and developed because Talichkin's collection back in 2013 was handed over to the Tretyakov Gallery, not to the Pushkin Museum. based on this collection back in 2003. The newest vectors collection was formed that ceased to exist last year, but they managed to do quite a lot. A colossal part was played by the Moscow International Biennale of Contemporary Art that opened up in January 2005, preceded by many years of continuous effort. The same tandem of Joseph Backstein and Victor Mesian starts to work on a large-scale manifestation. They start to put together a highly representative conference with leading curators of global renown, including Hans Ulrich Horlist, Zeeman, Bonamy, Chaland, all of the leading global curators would come to discuss the fate of the Moscow Biennale. A lot of them would come to the conclusion that Moscow doesn't need one. Others said that without the Moscow Biennale, we're not going to be able to survive. One way or another, Backstein and Mesian, in order to make this project happen, they got employed by Rossi Zoo, and they became parts of the Ministry of Culture. And as officials of the Ministry of Culture, they started to prepare for the first Moscow Biennale. And in order to strengthen the effects from this first large-scale exhibition, they invited international curators in order to develop the overarching concept. Iosif Backstein became the ambassador of the first Biennale. Mesian quickly dropped this race. Yaroslava Bubnova, Nicolas Bourriot, Rosa Martinez, and Hans Ulrich Obrist were able to put together something that wasn't quite understandable as a team back then, something that didn't seem to quite marry and work together, and didn't look too convincing in the interior of the Lenin's Museum that was chosen as the basis for the main project. It was nonetheless a very interesting exhibition, and these young international curators brought a lot of young, promising artists, including a lot of those that went on to become stars. Gupta showed his installations in Moscow for the first time, for instance. And of course, for Moscow, it was something that was shocking and that attracted a lot of attention. The work by the Gelatin Group, for instance. Some considered it to be obscene, some found it funny. Among the participants of the first Biennale, there were a lot of young Russian artists. But what's most important is that Joseph Backstein and his team, in order to get as much financing as was possible to source, because the Ministry of Culture wasn't too generous when it came to preparing and implementing this international Biennale. They created the Biennale Fund that would accumulate financing for the catalog, for bringing the artists over, for all the public programs. And Joseph Baxen did a lot personally in order to pull together a lot of events that accompanied the Moscow Biennale, and they turned out to be much stronger than the Biennale itself. It was an attempt to create this facade for invited stars to showcase the fact that Russia has great contemporary art, and this really worked. There was a very intensive program that accompanied the Biennale. It meant that you could walk around Moscow for an entire day and not be able to cover everything. The map of the first Biennale in Moscow is something that's very curious to have a look at from 2005. This was what started the intensive growth of the community of those that had never belonged to this community of underground art. They had no connection with art whatsoever. These were young, very advanced um, businessmen and wives, and they realized that contemporary art was a path into the imperialistic financial elite. After 2005, these institutions that were financed by serious capital started to blossom. I'm trying to open my water bottle. Exhibitions of international art in Moscow, of Russian art abroad, often turned into these large-scale Russian parties, like the Blue Noses group would perform their famous attractions with fireworks of pants. This was something that people really got carried away with, these performances of the Blue Noses. They would go to New York, they would go to Venice, they would go to Berlin, and they were always asked to reenact this performance. The world of contemporary art transformed completely, and exhibitions were more like performances for um, yellow media, for the Tatler Museum, for the Tatler magazine or Madame Figaro. At the same time, there was a parallel professional life that would bring an investment. Those that were trying to turn contemporary art into their brand, into their facade, into their tool of gentrification, if you will. In 2005, Alexander Mamut, the famous Russian businessman, invited Vladimir Dubasarsky, an artist who back then turned into a businessman himself. He invited him to develop a concept to reform the abandoned or the half-abandoned building of the Krasny Oktyabr confectionery plant, chocolate factory, in an attempt to change this place over, to change it into a cultural spot in the middle of Moscow. A girl, as usual, took this on, a famous manager. That's behind Olga Lopahova, 90% of the projects of the day. She supported the Russian pavilion at the Venice Biennale in 2005, among other projects. And she became the manager for the Art Strelka project, as it was called by founders. It had various garage spaces that were transformed into gallery spaces, into spaces for various independent platform. The Excel gallery opened its branch there. This is where in one of the garages, a club for collectors of contemporary art functioned. Artists would organize their self-organizations. There were performances that were held. There was a day that served as the opening of the space, and very soon Art Strelka came a space that would draw in crowds. These garages would be then abolished, and the British School of Design would construct other spaces. And finally, all of the Strelka buildings were transformed into something that looked very new and fashionable. A huge role in the development of the contemporary arts in the 2000s was played by this wonderful woman that came to Moscow in 2004, Stella K. Nobody knew who Stella K was, but she announced the opening of a commercial gallery in Skiratinsky Periulok, where, as per her ambitious statements, she was going to enlighten the Moscow public. The first exhibition that she held was Alex Katz's exhibition, followed by exhibitions of Basquiat, Andy Warhol, that of course were known in Moscow and nobody would buy them. It was easier to go to New York and buy them there. That's why soon after Sally Kasaeva, as it turned out, that was her name, she was the wife of one of the investors of Moscow City, one of Moscow investors. She decided to collaborate with an Italian living in Moscow, the well-known Teresa Mavica, that advised Stella Kisaeva to reformat her activities completely. She closed her commercial gallery and she started to develop two other platforms that became the main exhibition spaces for her new foundation, the Stella Kisaeva Foundation for conceptualist classics. There was a space in Mytne. For many years, this space was a platform for young artists from Backstage Institute graduates, from Sviblova's School of Rodchenko graduates. Each of these institutions that emerged in the 90s then had their own educational programs running. Stella Foundation, Stella Art Foundation Hall in Mytne Ulice was the space that brought them all together. In 2011, I think, Stella Kisaeva received the opportunity to become a commissioner of the Moscow Pavilion of the Venice Biennale. She was awarded with the Innovation Award. It was well deserved. What's a commissioner of a pavilion? Starting from a certain point, this is somebody that looks for funding. It brings in money. You're not just bringing together a team of curators, a team of managers, and a team of lovely workers. It's somebody who looks for investors and who looks for money. Over the course of the three biennales, she was able to support the Russian exhibitions. She organized Andrei Monastyrsky's project. She organized Vadim Zakharov's project, and Irina Nahova's project that I showed you over the course of one of our previous meetings. Thanks to Teresa Mavica's advice, this is now a space for artists in the non-standard reincarnation. Anatoly Osmanovsky, our famous foreign agent, that we're going to talk about in the course of our next sessions. He showed himself as a formalist, showing these very astounding works. And the Stella Art Foundation sponsored them. These were the famous Beatles and the famous bronze towers, toy tanks of different models. A lot of exhibitions that defined the mood of the generation. This is somebody that's set a trend that was formulated by Yevgeny Kikodze back in the day. This trend was called urbanistic formalism that Osmolovsky was able to create a foundation for. Stella Art Foundation provided the money for a series called Bread. This is 2007. And they were nominated and they won the first award named after Kandinsky, founded by a very famous Russian businessman, the iconic magazine editor Shalva Breus. So Natalia Smolovsky was the first to be awarded the Kandinsky Award. The echoes of the first Moscow Biennale of Contemporary Art, it could have been a coincidence or it could have been orchestrated. The Moscow Biennale served as a springboard, perhaps, but just as the Stella Kisaeva's foundations and the Vinzavod as a cultural cluster, this is where when it appears, it opens its doors before the reconstruction of the main buildings is completed. Sofia Trotsenko becomes the director of the complex of Vinzavod, an ex-factory. To develop this dark territory by the Korsky railway station, she invites a group of street artists that invites Muscovites, particularly interested in contemporary art. It was an astounding view. It was a growing interest to photography, and the first smartphones became widespread. There were people walking around Vinzavod to photograph everything. There was a lot of 15-year-old kids that would walk around the space to photograph every single detail. Thanks to the efforts of the administration of the Vinzavod territory, the space was gentrified, and it's a cultural cluster now with a lot of cultural institutions. That's exactly where the Excel Gallery is now located, Vladimir Ovcharenko Gallery, that's called Vladi Space, and the Sergei Popov's Gallery, and many other galleries are located, and a lot of other points that invite Muscovites that love to spend their time there and get immersed in contemporary art. A big role in consolidating these institutional connections belong to the gallerists of the older generation. Essentially, they taught the young that came to this business, they taught them how to manage things. So that's why Sofia Trotsenko, as she was formulating the concept for the gallery pool at Vinzavod, she agreed with the main galleries of Moscow that she would provide them huge spaces, restored in line with all of the demands of the gallery at gallery's expense, at beneficial terms. And this is what consolidates the foundation for its further growth. For instance, the white and red halls in 2007. This is where the first colossal exhibition is organized, dedicated to the metaphysical narrative in contemporary art, curated by Oleg Kulik. And it was a very successful exhibition that focused on meditation, on sacrality, religion, and the possibility of metaphysical approach to today's art. Another generation of younger managers emerges that help to build contacts with the public and develop a development strategy. And one of these characters is Nikolai Palashenko, who started his career as a 13-year-old, helping artists to create their works on a completely voluntary basis. Thanks to this, art would get more and more spaces that were legal, that were promoted, and they would dictate their will to the artist and the system of aesthetical values. And it was the institutional structures that were able to. Well, there's pros and cons to it, of course. The artist would criticize institutions for this very fact, but the wider audiences has to thank this institution. So it was the Stella Art Foundation and Vinsavod and the Dormix. I didn't have time to talk about it. The photography house, etc. They were the ones that were able to transform the chaotic art of the 90s into art, if not glamorous per se, but at least well inscribed with its own system of hierarchies, with its own system of values. Institutions are evil for those that want to be free and creative, and it's absolute good for those that want to be protected. And the second aspect of contemporary institutions is what drew the attention of the big authorities. At the end of the 2000s, they finally started to work on creating a cultural space. As the head of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, of course, there was no big love between these two spheres, but there were lots of hopes. The Center of Contemporary Art at Garage had a lot of hopes back in 2008. It opens its doors in an ex-Bakhmetievsky garage built by architect Melnikov, by Daria Zhukova and Roman Abramovich, in another building that was built by them. This is where we are today. But the Garage Contemporary Museum perceived itself not just as a platform that would bring in the stars with their expensive franchises. The key was to achieve a certain level. Oh, this is an installation by Monastyrsky from 2011 that's accidentally here. The key in the strategy of garage development was to insert itself into the social structure of the city, and any project would be, having produced it in from within the institution, it was then be turned towards public life of the citizens. This is the intent. This is the first step towards institutionalizing. It was very similar to the Stella Art Foundation as a center. The first step that the center took towards becoming a museum of contemporary art was this scientific research basis. that was created, and it was dedicated to contemporary art. In 2013, Garage turned into a museum of contemporary art, and in 2024, it started to uh, bring in a collection of what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. In the 20s, despite connections already built with the authorities and the viewers, we're still talking about very young and fragile art, a very young and fragile creature that's still going through its teenage years now, and it's still only establishing its fundamental baseline pillars to help artists and to create meetings with the viewers on this open territory. At this, I guess I'm going to wrap up today's meeting, unless you have questions, perhaps. No more questions? Thank you.